Ever since the car's invention back in the olden days of the 1800s, people have been obsessed with making them faster and driving faster in cars. And nowadays, you can see that through all of the super and hypercars and muscle cars that are obscenely expensive, but also insanely fast. And even if you're not balling quite hard enough to afford one of those muscle cars or supercars, you could still build something from the 90s or 80s with a massive turbo and a dizzying amount of boost and keep up with those for at least a minute or two. And this shows that the obsession with speed is still well and alive in 2023. But recently I feel like there have been a growing minority of people that think that cars are getting a little too fast. In today's video, I will be discussing that frightening proposition. The real beginning of this modern day obsession with speed, I think, was in 2014 when 4 notable cars were released. And the first of those cars was the Dodge Hellcat, which changed the face of muscle cars entirely. And before the Dodge Hellcat, most muscle cars were unsophisticated pieces of lard that had a good amount of power, but really were kind of stuck in the 80s still, as far as how they handled and the ergonomics of their interiors. And I think that in a uncharacteristic move, Dodge brought almost a little bit of class accidentally to the muscle car segment with the Hellcat. And as far as performance goes, it was one of the craziest cars of the time. It had 700 horsepower, but cost less than 100 grand, which was, I think, almost unheard of back in 2014. More importantly, the Hellcat changed how people viewed muscle cars, and it made everyone want a 600 or 700 horsepower muscle car as opposed to a 500 or 600 horsepower muscle car. And it's still a pop culture icon to this day. And you can look at just about any music video nowadays and see 3 or 4 Hellcats, some of which were probably stolen. And not many other car brands can say that about their car. And the other cars that really pushed the boundaries as far as performance goes really kind of come as a package deal, which is the Porsche 911, the Porsche 918, the McLaren P1, and the Ferrari LaFerrari. And these are for a slightly fancier sort of person than the Hellcat. Like, the Hellcat was built mostly for rednecks and trap goons, whereas these 3 cars are built for the well-off, the extremely well-off, as a matter of fact. Like, you have to have at least a few $1,000,000 sitting around in the bank just to buy one of these. And unless you want to live in it, which I wouldn't advise, you have to have a good bit more money saved up so you can have a house and things like that. These cars, because they're hybrids, I think really showed the automotive industry that hybrids were not just for the Prius and the Honda Insight and people that care about the environment, which isn't a bad thing, and put a bunch of really stupid bumper stickers on the back of their car, which I would say is a bad thing. And that has led to this new group of electric cars and hybrids that are incredibly fast and owe a lot to the Porsche 918, the McLaren P1, and the LaFerrari. And now, because of those cars, we live in a day and age where any average Joe could walk into a Ford dealership and buy an 800 horsepower Mustang. Or any slightly wealthier than average Joe could apply to buy a Aston Martin Valkyrie or AMG Project 1, which are basically hybrid F1 cars for the street. And this raises the question, why? I think that a lot of people believe that cars have gotten too fast, and one of the reasons people believe this is because you can't experience these hypercars at their limits on the street. You have to be at some sort of track, and even a lot of tracks can't hold that sort of power. The best example of this is the Aston Martin Valkyrie, which is really just an F1 car that has a roof and no regulations on what sort of aerodynamics it can use, except for those implied by governments. And it has a V12, which hasn't been an F1 for, 20, 30 years. And it also has the modern-day F1 hybrid system, which is a crazy combination. And this is a great car. except for driving on the street. You probably couldn't drive it on the street very far or very long without going absolutely nuts, because the engine is literally mounted to the cabin of the car. And that's all well and good when you're at Bahrain going 200 miles an hour down the front straight, but when you're driving to Whole Foods to pick up a smoothie of some sort, because that's, I guess, maybe the sort of thing that the owners of this car would do. Yeah, I don't think so, but just for argument's sake, if you're driving to Whole Foods to pick up a smoothie, you don't want your teeth vibrating out of your skull. And again, the point of this car isn't really to drive it on the street, but a lot of people are going to say, hey, why build a car if you can't drive it on the street and do what it's supposed to do? And I think there's some validity to these statements, but I don't know. At the end of the day, let the rich people do what the rich people want to do. And for the rest of us, we can drive around in Buick Regals that have way too much boost being crammed down the throat of a motorhome engine.